All right, well, thank you, Phil, the before and after shots. Nice introduction, but thank you. And I think the lesson from that is be careful what is on the web about you. You might be embarrassed. And I want to thank all of you. This is a wonderful audience. Just great to see all of you, and especially good friends that Anna and I have made already in our 2 years here in Oakmont. Just terrific to see friends here, neighbors, hiking buddies. I've come to a number of the symposiums, and so I've seen many of you, but it's a real privilege for me to be here with you this morning. And I also want to say how important I think the symposium is, not just for Oakmont. Personal story, when Pam and I were researching where to move once we were both retired, we discovered Oakmont and checking it out on the web and after we had visited. And one of the first things we learned about Oakmont was the Sunday Symposium. And we thought, what a wonderful series. A chance for people to gather from the community, talk about stimulating topics. The speakers looked interesting. So the symposium actually, whether you know it or not, it functions for us, and I imagine it has for other people, as a recruiting device for Oakmont. We've got a wonderful thing going. So thanks to the organizers over many years, the symposium has been with us. And thank you. It's a privilege to be here. I want to start with just a few kind of prefatory comments. A lot of you come almost every Sunday, and the banner is up here in front. And I wonder if you really notice it and think about it.
My wife designed it.
Right, okay. His wife designed it. Now, I'm not going to be critical of it in the least. But the motto, really true? Do we really believe this? Knowledge knows no bounds. Wonderful motto, but critical thinking for this morning. Think critically about that. Is it true? Does knowledge know no bounds? Or is this just kind of pious, secular, feel-good talk? How far can we push knowledge? How far should we push it? Phil said, I taught for many years undergraduates, ethics, philosophy of religion, aesthetics. Many of my students, when we would get to a certain point in each of those courses, would resist the kind of critical thought that I was encouraging and say, no, this is just, I don't know, the way I grew up, or this is just what I believe, and critical thinking has its bounds. Is critical thinking an essential part of knowledge? Well, I think so. If knowledge knows no bounds, critical thinking knows no bounds. Do we take critical thinking with us when we think about religion, when we think about personal moral values, when we think about aesthetic values? Or are those what you might call critical thinking free zones, that we're just not going to use our critical facilities? Politics. We've got our favorite candidates. Many of you have voted already. Debate coming tomorrow. Are you going to be easier on your favorite guy? Not think as critically about the approach that that person takes? Do we use critical thinking with no bounds? Should we? Okay, that's one. Here's another second kind of preface here. I wrote the description that some of you would have seen in the Oakmont News for my talk last summer. Very quickly, one statement that I made in that description was disproved. Disproved by the state of Texas Republican Party. You may have seen this news item. The comment that I made in my description of this talk today is that it's hard to find anybody who's against critical thinking. Motherhood, apple pie, and critical thinking. Well, here's the news from Texas. The state Republican Party platform for 2012 included a phrase that actually opposed the teaching of critical thinking in the state of Texas. Now I want to just quote the short rationale that they used for this. They opposed the teaching of critical thinking because, and here I quote, "it may challenge students' fixed beliefs and undermine parental authority." So courtesy of the Texas Republican Party, I stand corrected. Now, that is a cautionary tale from Texas. Well, here might be one from our own state of California. Some of you may know this. Since 1980, so for the last 32 years, the California State University system, the Cal State system, not the university system, Cal State has had a system-wide graduation requirement in critical thinking. If you graduate from a Cal State University, you must have passed at least one course in critical thinking. Now, for 32 years, our state has had that. Have we had an enhancement in the critical thinking facilities here in California? Hard to measure. Okay, my talk is going to be in 3 parts. First part has 4 what I would like to call moments, okay? Plus some commentary after the 4th moment. First moment. Imagine a scene like this that I'm going to describe. Now, some of you, maybe many of you, will recognize this scene. I'm stealing. And we'll come back to the source, but this is a familiar scene to some of you, and I'm not going to apologize for repeating it if you know this. I learn from it every time I read it or talk about it or think about it. So I hope you learned from it this morning, even if it's familiar. Okay, so imagine this. Imagine people living in a cave from childhood. Strange scene. They're prisoners. They're in shackles. Their necks, their feet are in shackles. They cannot turn their bodies. They're shackled to their chairs. They can only see what's in front of them. They're facing a high wall of the cave in which they find themselves. So we've got prisoners in a cave, can't move, looking at the wall in front of them. The dark cave has an opening to the outside, but the cave is lit by a fire that is behind the prisoners, so they can't see it. There's a low wall in front of the prisoners, so the low wall would be between the prisoners and the high wall that they're facing. Behind this low wall, people are carrying statues of common things, plants, trees, animals. And the statues are visible above the wall, but what they do is the firelight behind the prisoners casts shadows of these statues on the big wall in front of them. Now, it's a strange scene, but maybe we're like those prisoners in some ways. How might we be? Well, the shadows of the artifacts and statues cast on the cave wall in front of them. The fire is the source of light behind, creating those shadows. What would the prisoners think? This is their reality. We might say, well, they're mistaking shadows for real things. For them, the shadows are the real things. They're all the prisoners have ever known. Okay, that's moment 1. Now, a couple of reflections on that. First of all, what did I do first in introducing that first moment? I asked you to imagine a scene. Now, the point here is imagination, my way of thinking, key ingredient to critical thinking, and logic. Critical thinking and logic are closely aligned. Many people, many of my students certainly thought that logic and critical thinking were cold, abstract, no feeling involved. Not so. It begins in imagination. Cave is dark. Prisoners are ignorant, mistaking shadows for reality. But they're confident, we can imagine, that they know what's real, and it's what we would call those shadows. Well, put it almost paradoxically, they're ignorant. They don't know what's real, but they don't know their own ignorance. They don't recognize it. They're confident in their knowledge. Now, ignorance isn't stupidity. The prisoners aren't stupid. They just lack knowledge. They don't know what the full scene is. Okay, second moment. One prisoner is freed. What does he experience? If you answered, oh, he would get up. He would look around. He'd be interested to find out what the situation was. I'd say, failure of empathy there. Empathize with the prisoner. For life, you've been shackled to a chair looking in front of you. Okay, the shackles are taken off. Can you jump up? Can you walk around the cave? Can you see things clearly? Probably not. Your muscles would have atrophied. We've all been in the situation of sitting in an uncomfortable position for too long and your arm falls asleep or you get a cramp in your leg or something. So empathize with the prisoner. It's going to be difficult. Well, he's going to get up. This is temporary. He might turn around. The firelight would blind him. So very uncomfortable. He's blinded by the firelight, dazzled, can't make things out. Well, again, that blindness might be temporary. He'd get over it. Then he would be perplexed. He would say, I thought I knew what was going on, and now I don't. The illusion is shattered. It's going to be difficult for him to adjust to the real situation that now he knows he's in. Well, so he's gained an understanding, and he now thinks that those statues and artifacts that were casting the shadows, he thinks they're what's most real, and the shadows that he used to think were real are just shadows of them. Okay, end of moment 2. A couple of reflections. First, we need to use empathy. Again, imagination and empathy, my way of thinking, heart of critical thinking and logic. Second, the prisoner, what's happened? Liberation. Key idea here in my talk this morning. He learned his situation by being freed from the shackles. So gaining knowledge, gaining understanding is connected with freedom and liberation. But first, when the shackles were taken off, he had some pain and discomfort. He had some intellectual perplexity. So learning, even liberation, might not always be pleasant, might be difficult. Finally, he did gain a new understanding. Now he believes, well, I've said this, he thinks that the statues are what's most real. Okay, third moment. Prisoner is led up a pathway out of the cave. Now, why led? Why wouldn't he, I mean, he's released from the shackles, why wouldn't he, he sees the path, why doesn't he just go? Well, it's scary. Again, empathize. Might be dragons out there. He doesn't know. Been in the cave his whole life. He understands the situation in the cave now. Why take a risk? Okay, he's led up and out. Now, what would he experience in the outside world? Again, empathy is required. He's going to be dazzled by the bright sunlight, so he's going to be temporarily blinded again. He might be, having some pain and discomfort from being led up this steep, rough pathway out of the cave. But he adjusts. What might he experience? Well, the author of the passage I'm rehearsing here says, well, let's imagine that the first thing he notices are reflections in a pond nearby, shadows. The sunlight is casting these reflections and shadows from what he sees next. The trees, the animals that are out there in the outside world. So, what he finally realizes is those statues and artifacts in the cave down below, they were just copies of these things that now he's seeing out in the natural world. The prisoners in the cave were wrong about what's real. They mistake shadows for reality. And he was wrong when he thought that the statues and artifacts were the most real things. No, it's those things in the outside world. So, maybe you can imagine he would take pity now on the prisoners down below. They don't know what's going on. He does. Fourth moment. He returns to the cave. What does he experience? Well, he's blinded again. He's going from the bright sunshine outside back into the dark cave. He stumbles around. The prisoners, they might laugh at him. This guy went out there and look, he's coming back and he can't even stand up straight. He's bumping into things. Prisoners would think him crazy when he started telling them what's real. If you've ever been in a situation like this, I'm sure you can imagine it. Somebody says, I've got news for you. We were all wrong about something, and I'm going to set you straight. Well, we might think they're crazy. We might resent the person, too. We'd certainly have some resistance, well-founded. We've been here our lives. We know what's going on. And here this guy who can't even walk a straight line says he's going to set us straight about what's real and what's not. And he's going to tell us we've been mistaken and he knows the truth. I think we'd resist pretty strongly. They would certainly resist his efforts to educate them. Okay, into the fourth moment. Now,
The microphones.
microphone. Oh. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Let me know if anybody has trouble hearing. Okay, a few reflections on that scene that we've just had. So, in case you didn't recognize it, how many people did? Oh, good. Okay. You might have had a philosophy course or some experience before. The passage is one of the greatest classics of Western philosophy, Plato's dialogue, The Republic. The main speaker is Socrates. Plato concludes the section of The Republic that I've been talking about here in the voice of Socrates, saying this: "Our argument shows that the power and capacity of learning exists in the soul already. The prisoners had the intellectual capacity to learn, but they couldn't. And that just as the eye was unable to turn from darkness to light, those prisoners in the cave couldn't literally turn without the whole body turning, so too the instrument of knowledge can only by the movement of the whole soul turn from the world of becoming, those shadows and reflections, to the world of being, reality, and learn by degrees to endure the sight of being." Now, Plato's allegory of the cave gives us a model of learning and education. And in fact, if you know the source, the Republic, the Republic is Plato's kind of utopian description of the ideal republic. And it wasn't jobs for the middle class the ideal republic needed. It was education. Plato knows something here. Education needs to be good if you want to have an ideal republic. The allegory of the cave that I've just been talking about is in the section of the Republic about what kind of education people might receive in the Republic. Well, gives a model of learning and education, but I want you to think about this morning as a model of critical thinking. Critical thinking is difficult and demanding. It takes us out of our caves, if you'll permit me that, out of our normal state comfort zone, and we may resist just as the prisoners did. Critical thinking both requires a kind of freedom, so the prisoners had to be released from, the one prisoner had to be released from the shackles before he could begin learning. But then it also enhances freedom. As he learned, he was able to leave the cave and, importantly, to come back. Critical thinking, as the situation in the cave recognizes, critical thinking depends on recognition, acknowledgement of our own fallibility and ignorance. Again, not stupidity, but lack of knowledge. You're not going to learn anything unless you already know that you don't know everything. Overconfidence is the enemy of critical thinking. So we've got to acknowledge our fallibility. We have to be willing to revise our beliefs, give up even cherished beliefs in the light of new evidence, fresh perspectives, simply turning around, seeing something from a new point of view, acts of imagination, and empathy. Okay, can we have the screen back? Oh, that doesn't work. Okay, well, okay. All right, begin with a short, simple, oversimplified definition. Move from metaphor to plain speech here. Critical thinking. Careful, systematic, disciplined, you might say, formulation and evaluation of beliefs and supporting arguments using rational standards. Logic. Now, the key word here in this definition is argument. So, here's what I mean by an argument. For critical thinking and logic, an argument isn't a verbal dispute. There will be lots of verbal disputes between Romney and Obama tomorrow night. Are there going to be some arguments? Look for them. Critical thinking focuses on arguments. What's an argument? A set of reasons offered in support of a conclusion. It's an attempt at rational persuasion, not an attempt to persuade by appeal to authority, appeal to emotion, fear, popularity, innuendo, rhetoric. We're talking rational persuasion. Title of my talk is The Power of Critical Thinking. Well, what is the power of critical thinking? Plato's allegory suggests that maybe the power of critical thinking is a kind of freedom, a kind of liberation. You gain some freedom by practicing this disciplined, careful, systematic evaluation of arguments. Well, let's test that idea, okay? Test the idea, look at it, critical thinking in action, as it were, by formulating and evaluating a couple of very popular arguments for and against the existence of God. So, first principle of critical thinking, I just said, focus on arguments. We're going to consider a couple of versions of a very important argument for the existence of God. If we have time, a couple, we'll do at least one, argument for atheism against the existence of God. Putting critical thinking into operation. Okay. First argument for the existence of God. Let's get the next. Okay. The two versions we'll talk about, I'm calling them, first of all, the argument based on what are called irreducible complexities. I'll explain the term. Second argument is going to be based on what some consider to be the sheer improbability of our universe existing in the way that it does. Okay, let's begin the argument from irreducible complexities. I'll just leave that up. You can read through it if you're bored with me. The invitation comes from William Paley, 1802. One of the main sources for one of the most interesting metaphors for God, God the watchmaker, comes from William Paley. Paley was an Anglican theologian. What he says in this passage, in the book that it comes from, is he invites you to imagine walking on a heath. Desolate. You come on a rock. Big deal. Rock on a heath. Doesn't get my curiosity up. Well, maybe I'm just geologically challenged, and if I were a geologist, I might get interested in why that rock's there. But Paley says, not really notable. Well, you walk along, and you come on a pocket watch. This is 1802. On the ground on the heath. Well, that might wake you up. You might wonder how it came to be there. You might wonder how this intricate mechanism came to be in the first place, let alone be out there on the heath. Now, Paley says the inference is inevitable. The watch, unlike the rock, must have had a maker. Living plants and animals, Paley argues, are, of course, much more complicated and complex than watches. In his phrase, in a degree which exceeds all computation. How can we possibly account for the often amazing complexities of plants and animals? Paley reasons, 50 years before Darwin, 1802, Origin of Species, 1859, so he doesn't know about evolution by natural selection. Paley argues that only an intelligent designer could have created plants and animals, just as only an intelligent watchmaker can make a watch. He says the marks of design in nature are too strong to be got over. Design must have a designer. That designer must have been a person. That person was God. Paley's inference. Now let's generalize. The theory of intelligent design that we're talking about for now says because the natural world exhibits such great complexity and interconnectedness, it's reasonable to believe that it was designed and created by a supernatural God. As I said, I'm going to use two recent versions of this argument two versions of an argument for atheism as case studies in critical thinking. So if scientific creationism, as is known, were taught in public schools, this might be what would be taught. I've found through years of trying to teach critical thinking to undergraduates that the most effective way to teach critical thinking is to teach its principles in action, rather than just giving you a list of principles to memorize. Well, certainly debates about God's existence are interesting in their own right, so I hope they kind of capture your imagination this morning. But my bigger project is to illustrate critical thinking at work. Well, one basic principle of critical thinking is be clear about the terms you're using. Define terms. Well, I tried to define critical thinking to get us going. Now, we're debating God's existence, so I want to be clear about which God it is we're debating. Short answer is, it's the God of what are known as the great Abrahamic religious traditions: Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Muslims, Christians, Jews worship basically the same God. That's the God we're going to talk about. Let's call it the theistic God. Theism, belief in this particular God. Now, no, atheists can agree with this definition. We want to define terms that both parties to the debate will accept. So the definition doesn't commit you to believing in the existence of this God. Atheists say, this particular God doesn't exist. Theists say, this particular God is the one I think exists and I worship. So the theistic God. If you have the benefit of a Catholic education, this will be familiar to you. Kind of systematically thought through by St. Anselm, St. Thomas Aquinas, 11th, 12th centuries. Might be a strange concept of God to you, but I think understanding these concepts, it'll be familiar if you know about any of those three great religious traditions. So, first, God is self-sufficient and independent. He's the creator of the universe, but separate from it. So that separates theism from another ism that you might know about, pantheism. Pantheism is the view that God is in everything. That's not what theism accepts. Theism says God is separate from the universe. He created the universe. God's existence isn't dependent on anything else. He created us. He's not bound by the laws of nature. He's a supernatural being. All that packed into the first bullet point. Second, God is eternal. He's outside of time as well as outside of space. So you couldn't say God came into existence, God is going to go out of existence. He's eternal. Third, God is omnipotent, omnipotent, all-powerful. These terms might be familiar to you. Next, I'm sorry, I skipped. Omnibenevolent, all good. He's loving. He's just. He cares for his creation. And again, this distinguishes this theistic God from another ism, deism. Deism, the view that God might have designed and created the universe, but then leaves the scene. He's got better things to do than care about us. Theism says God cares about what he created. He's good. He is perfectly good, omnibenevolent. Omnipotent, perfectly powerful. Omniscient, all-knowing. Okay, enough. There are other details that are interesting and important, but we'll leave them. Is God male, for example? I'm not going to enter that. These are the essential important qualities for what we're going to do remainder of this morning. Okay, now, the theory of intelligent design does advance reasons in support of its conclusion that God exists. So it passes the first test, if you want to call it that, of critical thinking. It's got an argument. And in fact, if you know much, if you had that Catholic education that I referred to earlier, there are many other arguments for the existence of God besides this one. We're focusing on just this one. But it is an argument, not an appeal to emotion, not an appeal to authority of a text or a person. We've got an argument here. Now, okay, here's the argument. And again, I'll give an example of an irreducible complexity according to defenders of the argument, and then explain the steps that the argument goes through. Michael Behe, if you follow debates about scientific creationism, intelligent design, he's one of the leading figures here, defender of this version of our argument. He offers a very old-fashioned example of an irreducible complexity, an old mousetrap. A mousetrap has interconnecting parts: the spring, the lever, the platform, the bait, all of which are necessary for carrying out the purpose of the device, catching mice. Mousetraps are irreducibly complex things in this terminology. They require an intelligent designer. Their parts don't just come together, on their own or by random or by any physical forces. Intelligence is behind the existence of mousetraps. That's what an irreducible complexity is. Now, Behe and other supporters of this approach say irreducibly complex systems, like mousetraps, they exist in nature, not invented by human beings, at the molecular level. Now, we're not going to get very scientific here, but an example in the natural world of an irreducibly complex process, according to Behe, is the process by which blood in mammals coagulates. We might have people with a scientific medical background. What's called the coagulation cascade. The number of things that happen to you when your blood clots. Incredibly complex at the biochemical level. How did that process come about in mammals? Now, you can see clear evolutionary advantages of having your blood clot rather than flow freely when you get a wound. Survival of the species is going to be enhanced a bit when your blood coagulates. But how did all those ingredients of coagulation come to exist in mammals? Now, Behe says it's reasonable to believe that process happened by virtue of the creative acts of some intelligent being. God. Now, it's an argument. Is it a good one? Okay, we did the mousetrap. Go back to the argument. I'm going to ask two questions about the argument. They're the crucial questions about any argument when you're evaluating it. Are the premises true? Premise one, premise two. Are they true? Second, do they support the conclusion? So let's say, let's ask, are there irreducible complexities in nature? Kind of what you might call natural mousetraps. Are they? Well, I gave an example of what Behe considers to be an irreducible complexity. I'm going to argue there's no reason to think that there are natural mousetraps, irreducible complexities, even at the molecular level. What I think here is that to believe there are irreducible complexities in nature is to think that there are things that can't be explained by evolution or any other natural biological process. But that step in the argument commits a clear logical fallacy. The fallacy that's known as appeal to ignorance. The appeal to ignorance proceeds this way. We don't know how something could have happened, so it can't happen. Lance Armstrong, he's had a bad few weeks. What's his defense been? For his whole career, people suspected him of doping. He said, I've never failed a test. Now, you can't prove that I doped, so I can't have doped. Well, sorry, Lance. Now we know he did. He passed those tests, but there were other ways. Let's get some testimony from his teammates. There were other ways to show that he did. lack of knowledge proves nothing. A different example, Senator Joseph McCarthy, 1950, gave a list of 80-some names to the Senate, names of people who he thought were communists working in the State Department at the time. Well, the committee asked him about one of the names, and he said, well, I really don't know much about that person. The file is pretty slim here, but there is a comment in the file that there's nothing to prove that he's not a communist. Appeal to ignorance. Okay, basic principle of critical thinking, don't commit obvious fallacies. I hope we can all agree on that. Next question. Do the premises of the argument, even if they were true, support the conclusion? And my answer again is, unfortunately for this argument, no. Why not? Well, it's the theistic God that we're debating. Does that argument about irreducible complexities prove that an all-good, all-powerful, supremely knowing God exists? And the argument is no. Critical thinking approach. The argument doesn't even give reason to believe that the designer and creator of all those irreducible complexities, if they exist, and if it took intelligence to create them, it doesn't prove that it's a single being. I'll steal a phrase. Maybe it takes a village, not just one God. Maybe it was committee work that put together our universe. The argument doesn't say. The argument doesn't give reason to believe, on the basis of the reasons given, there might be other reasons, that this argument doesn't support the existence of the theistic God. Okay, we can come back to that. Second version of the intelligent design theory. Some defenders of intelligent design recognize the weaknesses of the argument that we've just been through. So they offer a different argument based in physics, not biology. Based in cosmology in particular, the part of physics and astronomy that studies origin, development of the universe. Most promising cosmological theory today, the most widely accepted one, is probably some version of the Big Bang theory, that's familiar to most of us in one way or another. But defenders of this newer version of the intelligent design argument say the chance of our universe with conscious human life in it developing out of the Big Bang is vanishingly small. Think of all the variables that had to be arrayed in exactly the right way to produce our universe. If any of those variables had been different in the slightest degree, the expansion of the universe after that Big Bang would have taken off in a different direction. It took off in our direction. It led to us and our universe. So, here's a quote from Stephen Hawking. Now, great quote, but he's not a defender of the argument from design. Here's what he says, though, and you might have read his book, A Brief History of Time. If the rate of the universe's expansion just 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million millions, that's pretty tiny, the universe would have recollapsed in a hot fireball. Now, he doesn't make this inference, but defenders of intelligent design do. The defenders of this new theory say, there are so many variables that had to come together in just the ways they did to lead to the creation of our universe. It's not reasonable to believe that the Big Bang was simply a spontaneous explosion with our universe as the product. It's more reasonable, they argue, to say that the Big Bang was, to use their phrase, fine-tuned. Another musical metaphor, orchestrated by some supreme intelligence in order for that Big Bang to lead to our universe. This version concludes that the supreme intelligence, power, and goodness of God is the best explanation for the fine-tuning of the Big Bang, which produced our universe. Now, is this a better, stronger argument than the argument based in biology, irreducible complexities? It's an interesting argument, but I'm going to point out some errors it makes. First mistake, we've already talked about it with respect to the irreducible complexity argument. Does it support belief in the existence of theistic God? No. Again, committee work or something. God might not be around anymore. Yeah, he orchestrated the Big Bang, but then, let's go with the deists and say he left the scene. One problem. Second problem, is it really so unlikely that our universe developed in the way it did, to include us and other living things in it? Is it so unlikely? And I'm going to point out there might be a mathematical error, a very simple one. Critical thinking requires a modest mathematical literacy. You've got to be able to kind of calculate basic probabilities here. Well, I brought a nickel. What are the chances that I'm going to get 10 heads in a row when I toss my nickel? Pretty small, right? Trick question. I didn't tell you how many times I was going to toss the coin. I just said, what are the chances of getting 10 heads in a row? If I only toss it 10 times, it's a pretty low probability. What if I toss the coin 1,000,000 times? A series of 10 heads in a row in 1,000,000 tosses? It's going to happen. I'd bet my retirement on that happening. Probabilities need to be calculated with some kind of rationale. Now, the assumption is the Big Bang only happened once. Is that assumption true? Well, some of you will be familiar with the idea that maybe there have been many universes, let's call them multiverses, created by many Big Bangs. Then, like getting a run of 10 straight heads in a series of 1,000,000 tosses of a coin, the chance of getting our universe with us in it goes way up. It's not so unlikely at all. Now, whoops. Okay. Did I just commit the fallacy of ad hoc hypothesis there? What's an ad hoc hypothesis? Why did Obama do so badly in that first debate? Oh, there was some secret crisis in the Middle East that he was dealing with that day. I heard a talking head, a commentator, say that. Ad hoc hypothesis. Yeah, there were problems in the Middle East, but nothing came up that day that he had to devote his attention to. Ad hoc hypothesis is a hypothesis that you bring in, no other reason to believe, other than that it's going to get you out of hot water. Well, is the hypothesis of multiverses and multiple Big Bangs an ad hoc hypothesis just to pick a fight with intelligent design? No. And again, this will be familiar to some of you. Theory of multiple Big Bangs isn't an ad hoc hypothesis. It was proposed by physicists in order to address scientific problems with the theory that there was only one primordial Big Bang. It's not an ad hoc hypothesis invented to address a religious question. But if it's correct, what I'm suggesting is it might have consequences for a religious theory. So if this line of thinking is correct, the argument based on the improbability of our universe isn't any stronger than the first one. Okay, part 3. Part 3. The case against the existence of God. We looked at 2 versions of a popular approach for thinking that God does exist. Now we'll look, as I said, 1 or 2 arguments for the non-existence of God. Now, I recognize, of course, and we can do this in the Q&A, defenders of intelligent design are going to have rebuttals to the objections that I raised. This is critical thinking, so the debate is perfectly appropriate and it's going to happen. And also, regardless of the strength of those attempts to prove the existence of God, even if they're weak arguments, some other arguments might be very strong that we haven't looked at this morning. And of course, another possibility is that God may exist, but just be unprovable. Lots of people take that approach. So I'm taking a particular approach here to debating the existence of God, focusing on arguments. Many atheists claim they've got sound arguments for the non-existence of God. So if they're right, theists can't have a good argument. The atheists claim God does not exist, and there are good reasons to deny his existence. I'll conclude by describing and evaluating one major approach. It's called the problem of evil. Let me start with just a little history. Horrific earthquake struck the city of Lisbon, Portugal, November 1st, 1775, Sunday, All Saints' Day. At the time, Lisbon had a population of, people estimate, 200,000 people roughly. Great Lisbon earthquake, 30 to 40,000 people in Lisbon were killed. San Francisco, 1906, population of 400,000. How many were killed? Only about 3,000. So the order of magnitude here is quite different. Catastrophic earthquake in the city of Lisbon. As in San Francisco's earthquake, the Lisbon quake was followed by a massive fire, ravaged the city. Many people who were killed in the fire, not just in the earthquake itself. Unlike the San Francisco earthquake, the Lisbon earthquake created a huge tsunami, which destroyed cities up and down the Atlantic coast of Europe and North Africa. Devastating event. Now, priests and theologians were quick to explain the tragedy as divine judgment, a warning. Despite the curious fact, historians point out, that while the earthquake destroyed virtually all the churches in Lisbon, while people were worshiping in those churches, the one neighborhood which was saved was the red light district. Well, other theologians took a different approach. They reasoned that while God's intentions behind the earthquake might be difficult for us to comprehend, still it must be for the best, the earthquake. Since in his goodness and power, these are theologians providing the explanation, in his goodness and power, God would only have created the best possible world, and all is always for the best. No matter how bad it looks to us, if God created the world, everything has to be best in the best of all possible worlds that God created. Now, in this interpretation, and some of you may see the reference here, those theologians in Portugal were relying on the thought of the German mathematician and philosopher Leibniz. The phrase comes from Leibniz that God, in his goodness and power, created the best of all possible worlds. Now, if you've read Voltaire's novel Candide, this is the optimistic approach that is mocked mercilessly in Voltaire's Candide. Voltaire, in fact, wrote Candide in response to the Lisbon earthquake and to those Christian explanations of the tragedy. Voltaire suggests that if our world is really the best God can do, as Leibniz might say, then he's just not much of a God. And not one that Voltaire was willing to worship. Now, Voltaire was using the terrible Lisbon earthquake as a case of what's called the problem of evil. Problem of evil has been a defense of atheism, but it's not just a logical point here. We've all wrestled with the problem of evil. Pain and suffering. We have felt pain. We have suffered. Our loved ones have suffered. For theists, Christians, Jews, Muslims, pain and suffering are existential issues for them to deal with in their religious faith. How could my God allow pain and suffering to occur? It draws some people closer to God, but it also has been an obstacle for many, giving people reason to give up their faith. Now, problem of evil. The name might be a little confusing and misleading. So I want to, again, use my own principle of critical thinking to define the term. We usually use the word evil to refer to mean, nasty, cruel things that people do to one another. In this context, the word evil means more than that. So, evil, the way I'm going to use it for the next 10 minutes here, pain and suffering, wherever it occurs, in human beings and in any other sentient animals that there are that can experience pain and suffering. So, evil, pain and suffering might be physical. Injuries cause pain. Might be mental. Anxiety, depression that we suffer from. Counts as pain and suffering, evil. what's called moral evil. Evil caused by human acts. Individual cruelty, individual acts of inflicting pain and suffering on another person, but also corporate actions, governmental actions. The actions of armies here count as moral evil. And last, natural evils, brought on by earthquakes, tsunamis, viruses. So evil, pain and suffering wherever it occurs. I'm going to show you the slide and then skip to another example of the problem of evil. Just we can come back to this. So I want to give you the idea. There are two versions out there among atheists. First version of the problem of evil says it's just logically impossible to reconcile the existence of pain and suffering in our world with the existence of an all-good, all-powerful God. Can a square have three sides? No. Could God have created a world with pain and suffering in it? If he's all good, he wouldn't have wanted to. If he's all powerful, he didn't have to. But we've got pain and suffering. Shouldn't have. You either have to say, there's no pain and suffering in the world. Well, theists aren't willing to say that. Or, there's no God. Tough dilemma for believers. We can come back to that in the Q&A if you want. Empirical version of the problem of evil. The logical problem is a tough nut to crack, as it were. Truth is, though, my own view is, of the two arguments, the empirical version is probably the stronger one. Now, I'm going to start again with a call to imagination. Imagine, if you will, that you're a visitor to Earth from a galaxy far, far away. You're a good critical thinker, though. You note the great beauty of our world. You note its complexity. You're impressed. But you, now, the extragalactic you, not the earthling you, you're using your imagination. You've got great powers of empathy. You're distressed to observe the amount of pain and suffering in this world and its intensity, its quality. A lot of terrible pain and suffering. Then you're puzzled when some native earthlings tell you that their world was created by and is cared for a supremely good and perfectly powerful being. You use your powers of critical thinking, and you might claim, with all due respect, that the evidence is very weak for the theory that this world is God's creation and concern. Now, Christians, Jews, Muslims might reply, well, evil, pain, suffering, they often have redeeming value. Suffering builds character. Great tragedy and hardship often calls forth the best in human beings. We respond with strength, with compassion, with courage, generosity, and kindness. All these virtues would be lacking in a world without evil, pain, and suffering. Well, you, the extragalactic visitor, might say, yes, but. Yes, some evil, some pain and suffering does have redeeming value. But I also see, visitor to your planet Earth, I see gratuitous evil, needless pain and suffering, pointless pain and suffering seem to be all too common in your world. Some evil seems to produce more evil. People do mean things, and then people do meaner things in return. Examples of needless suffering, they're just too easy to think of. And again, we've all experienced, but we're just sure. I didn't have to go through that. So think of the young child suffering from a viral infection that leads to a slow death. Think of a wild animal. Let's think of non-human cases. So a deer is burned in a wildfire. No humans around. Fire was caused by lightning. The deer suffers for a few days and then dies. Pointless pain and suffering. So here's the logical argument. Now, note the probables here. Important part of this argument. First premise, probably pointless pain and suffering is common. The existence of God for this approach is treated as a hypothesis. Cases of needless pain and suffering are treated as evidence against the God hypothesis, and that first probably acknowledges that appearances might be deceiving. The examples I gave might not be cases of pointless suffering. It's just that we might not be able to comprehend the point of those instances of suffering. So, probably needless pain and suffering occur, but maybe from God's perspective, some greater good is brought about by all pain and suffering. Sure doesn't look that way, says the atheist. The second, probably, in the conclusion, acknowledges that no amount of evidence can conclusively demonstrate the absolute truth of any hypothesis, whether we're talking science or religion. Can't absolutely prove the truth of a hypothesis. The atheist is a modest one. The evidence available to us strongly suggests to him or her that God probably doesn't exist. Next principle of critical thinking, we got, I think, just one more maybe, that I'll mention this morning, is that a good critical thinker proportions the strength of his or her belief to the strength of the available evidence or reasons supporting that belief. Robust evidence, lots of reliable evidence in favor of a hypothesis, and scant evidence against the hypothesis warrants strong belief. On the other hand, weak evidence, combined with strong evidence against a hypothesis, licenses rejection of the hypothesis. This is just kind of part of the scientific method, but it's a basic principle of critical thinking. Those who are prone to set their standard of belief too low, those prone to accept beliefs on weak evidence, go. On the other side, those who set their standards too high might be hyper-skeptical. Goldilocks principle, that the temperature just right here. So, how strong is the evidence of pain and suffering, pointless, needless, gratuitous pain and suffering, against the existence of God? I'll leave this to you. We've got a Q&A in just a minute. I'll just say this much in conclusion. First, the theistic God either exists or not. Either theism is true or atheism is true. No third way. No middle ground. And again, Q&A, if you've got a third way, let's hear it. Second point. What's rational for us to believe depends on the strength of the evidence and reasons available to us. This is the last principle for the morning. The evidence and reasons available to us change over time, and the evaluations of their strength might also change. So, example, 60 years ago, it might have been rational for parents to believe that secondhand smoke didn't cause any danger to children growing up in that household. Maybe some of us grew up in houses like that. Today, weight of evidence supports strong belief that secondhand smoke in the household is damaging to children. Now, secondhand smoke was always damaging, but appropriate evidence changed, available evidence. Now, some theists and some atheists recognize that last principle of critical thinking. Let's call them modest theists and modest atheists. Modest theists, they recognize their own fallibility. Go back to the allegory of the cave. Recognizing your own fallibility, important first step in critical thinking. The modest, critically thinking theist says this: there are some good reasons to believe in God. And there's a possibility that what looks like pointless evil to us may in fact have some justification from God's point of view. So I, the theist, believe. And that's not the last word for the theist. The modest theist says, and I might be wrong. The critically thinking, modest atheist, on the other hand, says there are no good reasons to believe in God, and pointless pain and suffering are just too common to be compatible with an all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing God. So I do not believe. And I might be mistaken. So thank you, and I look forward to your critical comments.
Thank you very much for this stimulating discussion, which I'm sure shall encourage a few questions from the audience. I would suggest if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and speak into the microphone. I will start off with Kate.
It seems that your arguments on either side of the point assume that the knowledge and information that's available is all there's ever going to be on that planet. And I don't think that's probable.
Okay, so a great question. What if all the information is in on this issue? Well, short answer is, if you're pretty sure that all the information is in, all that you need, then take a stand, make a judgment. But my point about modest approaches in critical thinking still applies. Is it possible that more information is going to become available to us? And my own answer is, just from a scientific point of view, I'm not going to close the door. I'm not going to close the door. And I think that is part of the modesty of critical thinking, recognizing our own ignorance. And again, I've got to be clear, ignorance doesn't mean stupidity. Ignorance means we may not have the last bit of information. So here's a particular case in point that the theists might have in response to you. Many theists don't depend on arguments. Some theists depend on what's called revelation. They, or someone they trust, has had a revelation. God spoke to them, or appeared to them. Direct interaction, personal, one-on-one. If that happened, anybody in here, that would be new information. And you might weigh it, as good evidence. Some theists do. So I'm not going to close the door to new evidence coming in some form.
Richard Dawkins in a lecture last week said there is no such thing as supernatural. There's natural and super, just things that we don't have the means to explain yet, unexplainable, and it will come to have at some point. I have a question. The Pew Research said that about 30% of Americans are not atheist or theist. They are spiritual. Could you define the word spiritual for us?
Sam Keen is coming back. I went to his first talk. He's one of the people who says, let's talk spirituality, not religion. I'm honestly not sure. I can say this. I mean, I think the word spirituality means many things to many people. It probably does not mean belief in the theistic God that I was talking about. It's got a different object. If the spiritual people who call themselves spiritual, worship anything, it's probably not this particular God. And they may not have the form of worship that traditional Jews, Christians, and Muslims have. Maybe their religion takes a different expression. So I'm not going to try to answer your question very directly, because I do think that this new spirituality, which is a powerful force, not only in the United States, but I think in other countries as well, it takes so many different shapes and forms. Best I can do is to say it's not traditional religion. It's not traditional theism in particular.
I think that it's important to point out that a large segment of the atheist population has changed in the last generation. A generation ago, the atheists said there is no God, and got roundly criticized almost universally as being arrogant, presumptuous, to claim to know something that cannot be proved by critical thinking. And so they admitted that and changed their statement of philosophy so that the modern atheist does not say that anymore. The modern atheist says, I have a philosophy which does not require the notion of God, and it's much softer.
Excellent point. Excellent point. A couple of comments. One comment is, I think that you're correct about that tendency in atheist thinking. There are still atheists out there who are the harder core, in your terms, the old-fashioned atheists, still saying they know for sure that God doesn't exist. The kind of atheism that I was describing at the end of my talk, the critical thinking atheist, is not that absolutist. It's the modest atheist. Now that's one point. Second point I'd make in response to you is, goes way back to the beginning of my talk. Do we reserve any of our mental space from the discipline of critical thinking? Is our motto true? Does knowledge know no bounds? I think I heard you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think I heard you say that critical thinking can't get at the existence of God. Critical thinking does know bounds, if you take that approach. Now, this is very controversial. That's why I started with it. Do we really believe this slogan? Or, gentlemen in the back, do we say there are areas of deep concern in our lives which critical thinking can't touch?
Mike was handed to me. You just summed it up again. I was going to point out that exactly what you just said, that knowledge knows no bounds, or it doesn't. If it knows no bounds, we're always learning. That's why we're here today, to always continue to learn, and there's always something new, as we've shown.
Thank you.
Tell us, if you would, sir. Here I am.
Oh, right here. Thank you.
What is knowledge? Is knowledge myth, hallucination, vision, yearnings, or is knowledge empirical scientific fact, or both, or neither?
Great question. What is knowledge? Take a philosophy course. If you did. Knowledge knows no bounds. Well, it depends on what knowledge is. You know, again, you've got to define our terms. I was pretty clearly, I hope, using the word knowledge in a more specific way, not encompassing all the areas that you mentioned. I don't remember that myth, and I'm not sure what else you mentioned. I would not restrict knowledge to what we understand as scientific knowledge. I wouldn't do that. I would, though, say that without critical thinking behind it, it probably doesn't count as knowledge. What was critical thinking? Providing arguments, rational support for your points of view. Scientists try to do that, but so do philosophers, so do theologians. They're in the business of making knowledge claims. St. Thomas Aquinas, he thought that we could prove, and in fact, again, Catholic education, he gave you 5 proofs. If you didn't like one, there was another. If you didn't like that, he had 5 proofs for the existence of God. He thought any rational person would agree with all 5. He also thought, though, that if you didn't follow those 5 proofs, faith was enough to know God, and he used that word. Now, I would say if faith has the backing of the kind of critical thinking I was trying to describe, more power to it. Often faith is choosing to believe in the absence of good supporting arguments. That's not knowledge. So I'm reserving the word knowledge to something that's hard won. Good critical thinking has to be behind it.
A few minutes ago, you mentioned that some believers in God use the notion of a revelation that they had. God spoke to them. Using the tenets of critical thinking, how would you discriminate between people making that sort of a claim and somebody who's just psychotic or delusional or superstitious?
Right. Thank you for that question. Good question. If I may, it's a more general problem. Eyewitness testimony, personal experience, needs to be corroborated. You know, the cliche example is, so we have 10 different witnesses to a traumatic car accident. The worse the accident, the more divergent their stories are going to be about what happened. So, personal revelation, if it's one-on-one, as I was describing, good critical thinking is going to ask for some kind of corroboration. Either another witness, anybody else had an experience like that? Or can we fit that experience in with a more general theory that we already do have support for? Go outside of religion for a second to science. Scientists come up with theories that deny some basic assumptions of the science that's been going on around them. The theory of the multiverse and the multiple Big Bangs. That raised a lot of eyebrows. Now, the reason it's a credible theory, credible, not true, the reason it's a credible theory is because it does answer some unresolved issues in physics and cosmology. It serves those theoretical purposes. That's another way for a unique approach, revelation or a new scientific theory, to gain some rational credibility. Now, I'd also say, though, the honest answer for me to your question is, what's to distinguish the lone person claiming that God spoke to him or her from the person suffering from delusions? In some cases, not much. It might be a delusion.
Okay. Critical thinking is the basis of science, and inasmuch as there's often been disagreement between science and religion, I'd like to add this comment, okay? It's by an example. And it's an example of what happens when unfounded beliefs are, people mix that into their thinking process when they're looking for solutions to practical problems. I would call it almost critical thinking in reverse. But specifically, what troubles a lot of people these days is the anti-science pronouncements which have become so common in the current election cycle. You know, science and technology have led to more than half of our growth in our gross domestic product, and our standard of living has been enhanced by our health improvement and standard of living and so on. But one would think that our elected officials would embrace science much more than they do, but instead what we're seeing is an avalanche of naysayers in political circles, disregarding evolution and vaccines and global warming. They're bad-mouthing all of this kind of thing. This is not the way, it seems to me, to get answers to the problems that we're facing in the United States or in the world, for that matter. It's surely not critical thinking to be putting all these anti-science commentaries out. And the scientific community is very worried about it, and I think we should be too.
Good comment. I wouldn't be talking about critical thinking this morning if I didn't agree with you and think that it was crucial on gaining knowledge and making the kind of technological and economic progress that we've made.
In all your years of teaching this and your experience with critical thinking, have you ever encountered anybody who had a remotely plausible explanation of where the watchmaker came from? We're concerned that many people are concerned that all of this just couldn't happen. But what could happen is this magical, knowledgeable, powerful creature that created it all in the first place. Has anybody ever given you any kind of rational explanation for where that creature came from?
Tough question. Here's one answer that isn't going to satisfy you, and I'm not saying it would satisfy me. The answer is that designer, the watchmaker, didn't come from anywhere. Because let's go back to the definition of the theistic God. Eternal. Now, hard to comprehend, but eternal means no beginning. So that watchmaker, if he exists, didn't come from anywhere. That's the answer. Now, you're shaking your head, no, you're not going to go there, but things that we're familiar with in our world, yeah, they came from someone. The theory of the multiple Big Bangs, some of you probably know a lot more about this than I do. The two physicists who developed this theory said that there is no reason to believe that the series of Big Bangs doesn't go infinitely far back with no first Big Bang. Hard to understand.
We can't imagine.
But it's possible.
As you correctly pointed out, Darwin talked about evolution and survival of the fittest and wrote a book, Origin of Species, in 1859. 1984, Richard Dawkins, who was mentioned earlier, coined a term that I find fascinating called memes. I'm sure you're familiar with it, in which cultural characteristics are passed from one generation to the other. Religion is a good example. Not many Hindus become Catholics, not many Jews become Muslims, because the memes of the cultural characteristics are passed on. I'm going to suggest that critical thinking is interfered to a great extent by the memes that have been passed on from one generation to the next. Your comment on that, please.
Oh, absolutely. That's right. I think whether it's some Darwinian transmission, as Dawkins thought, of these cultural memes, or whether the religious commitments of people come about in geographical areas in different ways, there's no doubt that those kinds of commitments in different cultures are, I guess I'll use the word obstacle. Critical thinking, the rational attempt to persuade depends on finding reasons or evidence that are accessible to all. All is a lot of people from a lot of different cultures. And the means of those cultures might stand in the way. Now, some people, kind of skeptics, I guess, of critical thinking, may say, critical thinking itself, it's a meme of Western Enlightenment culture that we've inherited from people like Voltaire and Thomas Jefferson. And maybe it's getting in the way of memes from other cultures. Well, I'm not comfortable with that view. More comfortable with the slogan of our symposium. Mm-hmm.
I was doing the best I could during your presentation, which I thought was excellent, to be a critical listener. And after you talked about God, I said, doggone it, he hasn't defined evil. And then you went ahead and defined evil. My question is this. When I looked at your definition of evil, it seemed commercial and secular. Have you ever been questioned by any of your students regarding evil that is not secular evil, an expanded definition of evil that might be also supernatural rather than natural?
Interesting question. And say if I'm not understanding you. From a theistic point of view, and maybe especially Christian, although Judaism probably also, evil means sin. Sin means separation from God. It doesn't mean just physical and mental pain and suffering. Now, maybe pain and suffering, mental, physical, kind of comes with the territory of sin and separation from God. But if that's more what you have in mind with a religious approach toward the concept of evil, then the short answer is, yeah, plenty of people in my classes and elsewhere have said, you've loaded the dice against theism, you've given a secular, non-theistic definition of evil. Let's start with the idea of separation from God. One response to that is, that might beg the question on the other side of the debate. We're debating the existence of God, atheists and theists. If we define evil, you just pointed out, In a secular way, maybe we've loaded the dice in favor of the atheists. But don't we do exactly the same? How could evil be separation from God if God doesn't exist? There's kind of a quip that I've heard atheists give. You want to give up sin? Real easy. Give up God.
Hugh, I was struck by the modesty of the distinction you drew at the end of your talk about whether something's the result of critical thinking. You said it's a belief based on evidence and rational argument. Other people have drawn a kind of stronger line. It seems to me, I'm thinking of Karl Popper, who has a test for whether something is knowledge, a matter of knowledge, or a matter of belief. Could you comment on sort of how you drew that line?
Yeah, interesting question also. There are lots and lots of definitions of critical thinking. The one you alluded to, Sir Karl Popper, my familiarity with it, kind of properly speaking, it's a demarcation of what counts as good science and what counts as quack science. And his idea is specifically, if your hypothesis isn't falsifiable, then it's not good science. And it's not rational thinking. If you can't disprove the hypothesis, and then he and others have gone on to say if God is supernatural, you can't disprove the existence of a supernatural being. We're natural beings. We're kind of stuck in this world. Well, interesting concept. I guess all I can say is there are lots of different definitions of critical thinking. I tried to pick a pretty kind of low threshold here. Make it relatively easy to engage in critical thinking. Now, when you get into the details matter, and critical thinking gets harder and harder, and I only gave some very general, they were common sense, weren't they, those principles of critical thinking? They aren't very controversial. I was trying to set the bar low so that we would get some agreement about what critical thinking requires. If you set the bar higher, then again, you're going to have people accusing you of loading the dice in favor of one approach or another, and I didn't want to do that. But thank you. Yeah.
Well, we want to thank you for a most stimulating talk session. And we hope to see you next week. Thank you for your comments.